I want you to imagine a business scenario for a second. Like, really picture this. You are running a manufacturing company, right?
Okay, I'm with you.
And you are selling your core product for a tiny fraction of what it actually costs you to make it. And I mean, a minuscule fraction.
Well, that sounds like a terrible business plan already.
Right. But think about the expenses. You've got the massive energy required to run your high-pressure factory, the freight trains to ship the goods, the raw chemical materials. Every single one of those line items costs significantly more than the final price tag on your product.
Oh, wow.
Oh, and here is the kicker. You have been selling it at almost exactly that same price for years. Decades, practically.
I mean, if you pitched that model on a business reality show, they would laugh you out of the room. They'd tell you your business model defies every basic law of unit economics, and, you'd be bankrupt by Tuesday.
Exactly. But what if I told you this isn't some doomed startup? This is actually a description of a massive multi-billion-dollar publicly traded sector.
It's wild, but yeah, it's entirely real.
Today, we are doing a deep dive into an incredibly insightful analysis. It's from a newsletter called Equity Decoded by Spirit, and the piece is titled, Why Fertilizer Companies Are Not What They Look Like.
And it is a fascinating read.
It really is. Our mission today is to completely decode the Indian fertilizer sector.
Yeah.
We're going to look at why traditional financial analysis just totally falls apart here. And we want to give you the ultimate shortcut to avoiding some major investment traps.
Yeah, because it is a truly fascinating space.
Yeah.
It essentially forces you to unlearn almost everything you assume about market dynamics. Like if you approach this sector with a standard financial screener, you are guaranteed to misinterpret the data.
So let's set the scene with this incredibly vivid anchor the source provides. I love this image. Picture a farmer in Sitapur, Uttar Pradesh.
Okay.
He walks into a local cooperative outlet and he buys a 45-kilogram bag of urea fertilizer. He pays somewhere between, let's say, 242 and 267 rupees for that massive bag.
Right.
And he's been paying almost that exact same price for years. So just fundamentally, how is that mathematically possible for the company producing it?
Well, that right there is the single most important fact to understand about this entire industry. That 242 rupee price tag. It's fixed by law.
Wow.
Yeah, it is the maximum retail price, or MRP. The company cannot legally charge the farmer a single rupee more.
So they're just taking a massive loss on every bag.
Not exactly. The yawning gap between that tiny retail price and the very real, very high cost of production is not absorbed by the farmer, obviously, but it's not permanently absorbed by the company either.
Oh, okay. So where does it go?
That gap sits directly on the government of India's books.
Oh, I see. So the government is essentially picking up the tab for the difference just to keep agriculture viable for the farmers.
Exactly. That is the policy. To understand this sector, you really have to accept a fundamental reality.
Yeah.
Pricing in the Indian urea market is not a business decision. It is purely a government policy.
Which changes everything.
Right. Once you realize that, the entire way you look at the mechanics of these companies just has to shift.
Which means we need to talk about what the source calls the quasi-government trap.
Yes.
Because if your retail price is rigidly fixed by law, the core engine of how your company generates revenue is entirely dependent on a third party. You aren't really selling to the free market. You're selling into a government policy framework.
And the scale of that framework is just staggering.
Yeah.
I mean, just to put some numbers to this, for the fiscal year 2025 to 26, the government's revised fertilizer subsidy bill was an astronomical 1.86 lakh crore rupees.
Wait, 1.86 lakh crore?
Yeah. And looking ahead to FY 26-27, the budget set aside 1.71 lakh crore. To give you a sense of proportion, roughly 2/3 of that entire mountain of money goes directly to subsidizing urea alone.
That is, I mean, those numbers are almost hard to wrap your head around. It's a massive chunk of the national budget. But how does that money actually flow to the companies? Like, does the government just hand them a massive check at the start of the year based on what they plan to produce?
Oh, no, not at all. The flow of funds operates through something called the Direct Benefit Transfer System, or DBT.
Okay, DBT, how does that actually work on the ground?
Well, here is how it plays out. The fertilizer company sells the 45-kilo bag to the farmer at that fixed 242 rupees.
Right.
The government then reimburses the company for the massive difference. But, and this is the crucial part, the government only pays out after verifying the actual sale to a specific farmer.
Oh, so they have to prove it.
Exactly.
Okay.
They use point-of-sale machines with biometric authentication at the dealer outlet. This is all to ensure the urea isn't being smuggled across borders or, diverted to industrial chemical plants.
Okay, let me try to translate this into a daily scenario for everyone listening. So
Sure.
this is like running a restaurant where the customer pays $2 for a premium steak dinner.
I like this. Go on.
So you, the restaurant owner, you still had to buy the expensive beef, right? You have to pay the chef, keep the high voltage ovens running, and the government promises to mail you a check for the remaining $48 weeks or maybe even months later, but only if you can prove with a verified biometric receipt that the customer actually sat down and ate the steak.
That analogy perfectly highlights the exact friction point here, the delay.
Right.
I mean, the intention behind the DBT system is to stop leakages and black market sales, and it is a very logical policy goal. But in practice, verifying millions of individual transactions across rural India creates a massive administrative bottleneck.
I can imagine.
Depending on the government's cash position at any given moment or how busy the planting season is, that subsidy money can take weeks or months to arrive.
Meaning the company is essentially forced to float a massive loan to the government while it waits to get paid. But beyond just the cash flow nightmare, I'm stuck on something else. When your biggest customer is your regulator and prices are set by policy, doesn't that completely kill the competitive spirit?
Yes. What's fascinating here is that it creates a massive competition void. Think about a normal free market, right?
Okay.
If you are incredibly efficient and cut your operational costs, you can either lower your prices to steal market share or keep prices the same and enjoy massive profit margins.
Sure, standard capitalism.
And if you are inefficient, the market punishes you and you go bankrupt. But in this regulated urea market, the most state-of-the-art, hyper-efficient plant and an aging, clunky, inefficient plant both sell that bag for the exact same 242 rupees.
And they both get reimbursed by the government.
Right. They both get reimbursed based on a complex formula.
So there's no existential threat forcing them to be ruthlessly efficient.
Exactly. The source notes that while there is some minor reward for efficiency under the government's new pricing scheme, the system simply does not harshly punish waste. It doesn't create that relentless, cutthroat cost discipline you see in standard manufacturing industries. And to be fair, this isn't a failure of the company's management. They are simply playing by the rules of the chessboard they're placed on.
Okay, but if the government dictates the price, backstops the revenue, and essentially removes standard competition, how on earth do you value these companies? Because if I use my standard financial screener to look for investments, it sounds like I am walking into a minefield.
Oh, you are walking directly into what the source calls the ratio traps.
The ratio traps.
Yeah, this is where so many investors get burned. They use the standard measuring sticks for a very unique, non-standard business.
Okay, let's take the classic PE ratio, price to earnings. If I'm scanning the market and I see a company trading at an 8x PE, I'm immediately interested. It looks like a massive bargain.
Usually.
So what does this all mean in the fertilizer world? Why is an 8x PE potentially a trap?
Because in this specific sector, an 8x PE usually does not mean the business suddenly became wildly profitable or is deeply undervalued by the market. It might simply mean that the government finally cleared a massive backlog of delayed subsidy payments all at once during that specific quarter.
Ah, okay. So a giant wave of cash hits the balance sheet all at once, creating this optical illusion of a profit boom.
Exactly. They get a huge influx of cash that artificially boosts that specific quarter's earnings, making the PE ratio plummet so the stock looks cheap.
But it's not actually cheap.
Right, because that money was actually earned by selling fertilizer many months ago. So what happens next quarter if the government's payments slow down again?
The earnings drop.
They could plummet 60%. And suddenly that cheap stock is trading at an expensive 25x PE. The underlying business didn't change at all. The only thing that changed was the timing of government cash flows.
That is wild. And the source points out that revenue growth can be just as deceptive.
Oh, completely.
Like, if I see a company boasting 20% top-line revenue growth, normally I'd assume they are aggressively expanding, right? Selling more products, winning over more farmers.
In a normal market, yes. Here, a 20% revenue growth might just mean the government raised the subsidy rates to cover higher global raw material costs.
Wow. So they didn't sell a single extra bag?
Nope. Both scenarios, selling more physical fertilizer or just getting a bigger subsidy check per bag, they show up exactly the same way on the sales line of an income statement.
But they tell completely different stories about the health of the business.
Exactly. If you want to know if a fertilizer company is actually growing its market footprint, you have to look at volume growth per ton, like how many physical bags are moving. The rupee revenue is just noise.
Okay, but let me play devil's advocate here on the working capital issue. You mentioned the delayed payments.
Yeah.
The source uses Chambal Fertilizers as a prime example. They're the largest private urea maker in India. And I look at their balance sheet for the end of FY25, and it looks pristine.
It does.
They ended the year with just one single debtor day. Their interest coverage ratio was a massive 51.6x, and they had almost zero debt. Doesn't that prove the direct benefit transfer system is actually working perfectly? Like, why should I be worried if their yearly snapshot is that strong?
Well, Chumbal's annual snapshot is incredibly strong, and it does prove the DBT system is better than the chaotic regimes of a decade ago.
Okay.
But wait, here's where it gets really interesting. You can't just look at the annual report and call it safe, because that annual report is a carefully timed photograph.
A photograph? How so?
The source points out that if you dig into the specific quarterly data, specifically Q3 of FY26, which is December 2025, Chamal's subsidy receivables suddenly jump to 1,979 crore rupees.
Wait, really? Why the sudden jump in December specifically?
Because December sits right in the middle of the Rabi sowing season, the winter crop. Agricultural demand is highly seasonal.
Oh, I see.
During peak quarters, sales explode, and those point-of-sale machines are working overtime. The receivables pile up massively before the government machinery can process them all and disperse the funds.
So the stress is still there. The working capital stress hasn't vanished at all. It's just playing hide and seek in the quarterly fluctuations.
Exactly.
And if you only read the annual report, you completely miss the cash crunch they endure mid-year.
You always have to check the quarterly receivables notes. And we zoom out to the bigger picture of capital, we have to talk about ROCE, return on capital employed.
Right, because these plants are not cheap to build.
Not at all. Fertilizer plants are incredibly complex engineering marvels. They are massively capital-heavy beasts requiring high-pressure synthesis reactors and, extensive pipelines.
The source gives some crazy numbers to illustrate this. Like, Madras Fertilizers is planning a 10,300 crore greenfield complex in Chennai.
Huge number.
And the new Namrat plant in Assam costs around 10,600 crore to build for roughly 1.27 million tons of capacity. Those are enormous upfront investments just to get into the game.
This is where the math becomes unforgiving. If a company spends over 10,000 crore to build a plant, their cost of capital, the interest they pay on debt, the return shareholders expect, it might be around 12%.
Okay, 12% cost of capital.
Right. If, because of the rigid government subsidy structure and delays, they only earn a 10% ROCE on that massive pile of money, they're quietly destroying value.
Even if the stock price jumps.
Exactly. Doesn't matter if the stock price jumps during a good subsidy quarter. Mathematically, they are bleeding shareholder wealth over the long term. They are borrowing at 12 to make 10.
That's a slow death.
Yeah. The source points back to Chambal here as the benchmark. In FY25, Chambal achieved a 28% ROCE, largely helped by being debt-free. That 28% is the hurdle rate you want to look for.
Okay, so if the standard financial ratios like PE, revenue growth, even annual debtor days are just these mirages reflecting government payment schedules, how do you actually tell a good fertilizer company from a bad one?
You have to look at the physical realities.
Right, like if we strip away the financial illusions, what should an investor look at?
You have to look at the operational architecture of the company. The very first filter the source recommends is the product mix.
Because, if being stuck in the urea market means having zero pricing power, shouldn't these companies just try to make something else?
The smart ones do exactly that. Companies that have meaningful revenue from non-urea products like DAP, which is diammonium phosphate, or NPK blends, which combine nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, they operate under a different framework.
Oh, what framework?
It's called the Nutrient-Based Subsidy Scheme, or NBS.
How does that scheme give them more freedom?
Well, under the NBS scheme, the government provides a fixed subsidy amount per kilogram of nutrient, rather than capping the final retail price.
Oh, that's a huge difference.
It really is.
Yeah.
This means the companies have slightly more freedom to adjust the final price tag based on market demand and raw material costs.
Oh.
So a company with a diversified product mix containing DAP and NPK blends isn't entirely a hostage to the ministry's fixed-price urea disbursements.
Okay, so diversification buys you a tiny bit of free market oxygen.
Exactly.
But the source then dives into what it calls the biggest structural variable, feedstock. This is all about natural gas. How does the fuel source separate the winners from the losers?
Natural gas is both the primary fuel and the raw material used to synthesize urea. And here we basically have a tale of two gases.
Okay.
On one hand, you have APM gas, administered pricing mechanism gas. This is domestically produced gas. It is relatively cheap, and its price is regulated and allocated by the government.
And the other gas.
On the other hand, you have RLNG, regasified liquefied natural gas. This is imported, and its price swings violently with global energy benchmarks like Brent crude or Henry Hub.
Let me make sure I'm following this. So some companies get an allocation of the cheap domestic gas, while others are forced to buy the volatile imported gas on the open market.
Correct. And when global LNG prices spiked massively after the geopolitical supply shocks of 2022, the companies relying on imported RLNG saw their profit margins absolutely crushed.
Because their input costs skyrocketed, but their retail price was still fixed at 242 rupees.
Exactly. The input cost goes to the moon, but you can't raise prices. The companies with access to cheap domestic APM gas, though, they weathered the storm beautifully because their primary cost driver was insulated from the global panic.
So it's not just a nice to have.
No. If we connect this to the bigger picture, access to cheap domestic gas is a permanent advantage. It's not a one-off stroke of luck. It is a permanent structural moat that defines a company's baseline profitability.
Okay, so domestic gas shields them from global shocks. But gas is just the fuel and base element. What about the supply chain, like the actual raw chemical ingredients? If they are buying those on the open market, aren't they just trading one vulnerability for another?
That brings us to backward integration, specifically integrating into ammonia. Ammonia is a crucial intermediate chemical synthesized from natural gas and nitrogen, and it's used to make the final fertilizer.
Okay.
If a company has to buy ammonia externally on the commodities market, they take on massive price risk. If there's a global shortage, they pay the premium.
But if they synthesize their own ammonia in-house?
They capture that margin.
Yeah.
And they stabilize their entire cost structure. Making it in-house is a critical layer of defense against supply chain shocks.
Yeah.
You are entirely insulated from intermediate commodity shocks compared to those who buy it externally.
That makes total sense. We've looked at what they make, what gas they burn, and how they source chemicals. But what about the executives running the show? I mean, how do you judge management quality in a sector where a government ministry basically makes most of the strategic pricing decisions?
It's tricky, right? The source argues that management quality in this sector isn't found on earnings calls or in glossy presentations. It's buried in the footnotes of the balance sheet.
Where specifically?
First, in the debtor's schedule. You need to look at whether their subsidy receivables are growing faster than their actual revenue.
First, if receivables are outpacing revenue, it means they are fronting more and more of their own cash for the government.
Right. They are bleeding liquidity. And that was a huge warning sign during the fiscal constraints of the FY 2020 to 21 period.
What else should we look at?
The other major indicator of management quality is capital allocation. When a fertilizer company actually does have surplus cash, what do they do with it?
Do they blow it, basically?
Yeah. Do they invest in adjacent synergistic areas like agri-inputs, crop protection chemicals, or soil testing infrastructure? Or do they just wander into completely unrelated sectors just because they have cash burning a hole in their pocket? Discipline is everything.
Okay, but here's the thing. Even if you find the perfect company, great product mix of NPKs, in-house ammonia synthesis, cheap APM gas, brilliant management, they are still operating inside a rigid box built by the government.
They are.
And according to the source, as we head into 2026, the government might be getting ready to change the shape of that box entirely. Let's talk about the unpriced policy risk.
This is the critical factor the broader market is currently ignoring. These companies live in a tight triangle. The government controls their gas supply, fixes their retail price, and dictates their cash flow through subsidies.
They hold all the cards.
All of them. Policy risk isn't just a footnote. It is the ultimate driver of the sector's reality.
The source points to a massive catalyst for this. The Economic Survey 2025-26, which was released in January 2026. The government's own top economic advisors openly suggested doing the unthinkable. Raising the retail price of urea and moving toward direct cash transfers per acre directly to the farmers.
Essentially, removing the price cap entirely and dismantling the very subsidy mechanism that currently defines the industry.
It feels like these companies have been playing a highly strategic, incredibly complex game of chess for decades, But at any moment, the referee can just walk up, tilt the board, and completely change how the pieces are allowed to move.
That is exactly the dynamic. Because of that, the source outlines three distinct futures that investors absolutely must weigh. First is the base case.
Okay, what does the base case look like?
Subsidies stay roughly the same. The DBT system keeps payments relatively smooth, and companies earn steady, predictable returns through the agricultural cycles. Status quo, basically.
Right. Then there is the bear case, where the government tightens its belt.
In this scenario, the government decides to control the fiscal deficit and cuts subsidy spending by 15 to 20% over 2 to 3 years.
Oh, wow.
This immediately squeezes the company's margins and brings back that severe working capital stress we saw back in FY 2020 to 21. They are forced to borrow heavily just to keep the high-pressure reactors running while waiting for delayed payments.
And finally, the tail risk. The tilted chessboard.
Gradual deregulation. The price cap is removed entirely, urea prices float freely, and the massive government subsidies go straight into the bank accounts of the farmers, bypassing the companies entirely.
Which would reshape the underlying economics of the sector overnight.
Exactly.
Now, I know the government stated they don't have immediate plans to implement this. However, when the top economic advisors are publicly publishing recommendations for a complete overhaul, the risk of that happening is no longer zero.
Not at all.
The source points out that the market is barely pressing in this tail risk right now.
That's the scariest part.
So let's bring this all together. We've covered a ton of ground today. If you are listening to this, the main takeaway is clear. Evaluating a fertilizer stock is not like evaluating a software company. You can't just ask, is this cheap, by glancing at a PE ratio on a screener.
No, it requires doing the hard work of looking past the headline numbers. It is entirely about understanding how a specific company navigates its deeply entrenched relationship with a policy framework that it cannot control.
You have to understand the mechanics of their feedstock, their working capital cycles during the sowing seasons, and their capital discipline over the long haul.
Right.
It all comes back to that anchor we started with, that 242 rupee bag of urea in Sitapur. If you understand the physical mechanics of how that single bag gets made, how it gets priced by law, and how the company eventually gets paid for it weeks later, you understand the balance sheet of the entire industry.
You really do. And, the source leaves us with a profound realization, but I want to take that one step further into the tail risk scenario we just discussed. It introduces a completely new threat to ponder.
What's that?
If the government does eventually move to direct cash transfers, it forces us to ask a totally new question. In an industry where your biggest customer, the landlord for your primary fuel supply, and your strict price regulator are all the exact same entity, are you actually investing in a standalone business?
Or are you just buying a financial derivative of government policy?
Exactly. And what happens to these aging, inefficient 10,000 core mega plants when they suddenly have to compete for the farmer's dollar in a brutal free market arena? Without the government's fixed price life support, do they survive, or do these massive industrial complexes simply become stranded assets overnight?
Man, that is a terrifying prospect for a shareholder, and a thought that should definitely linger next time you look at the holdings in your portfolio.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden machinery of the fertilizer sector. Until next time, remember to look at the physical reality behind the numbers, and don't let the ratio traps catch you off guard.